The orc girl saw the weathered timber walls of Fort Crossing through the dust of 200 cattle, and felt her stomach twist with a fear she had never once felt facing down a prairie fire or a flooded river crossing. Hessa Druvar had been riding point for 3 months straight, guiding the herd north along the frontier's oldest cattle trail, and her body ached in the familiar ways that made her feel real and useful. The leather rein sat comfortable in her calloused palms. Her boots were worn through at the heel. The sun had baked her green skin to a deeper shade, almost the color of summer oak leaves, and her dark hair hung in a single braid thick as a ship's rope down her back. She was 23 years old, built lean and strong from a life in the saddle, standing just tall enough to look most human men level in the eye. Her tusks were small, barely jutting past her lower lip, and when she smiled they showed white against her mouth. She was not smiling now. The fort squatted at the junction of 3 trade roads, a Chinese letter depot and way station for the Crown's scattered border posts. Hessa had passed through a year ago, trailing a different herd for a different outfit, and she had spent 2 weeks camped in the stock pens outside the walls while the fort's factors tallied and inspected every head of cattle before approving their passage east. 2 weeks. 14 days. She had traded for grain and salt pork and medical alcohol at the quartermaster's window, a narrow opening in the thick log wall of the supply house. The man behind the counter had been human, maybe 30 years old, with brown hair cut short and a build that was solid without being tall. Average height, broad through the shoulders and chest in the way of men who lifted heavy things for a living. He had measured out her requests without comment, his hands steady and precise, and he had never once flinched when her fingers brushed his during an exchange of coin. His name was Marcus Webb, and she had thought about him every single day since she left. It was a stupid thing, the kind of foolishness that made her feel young and silly. She had no claim on his thoughts. They had spoken perhaps a dozen sentences to each other total, brief exchanges about inventory and prices and weather. He had been professional and courteous, which in a world where most humans cross the street to avoid walking past an orc was enough to leave an impression. She told herself that was all it was, gratitude for basic decency. But she remembered the way his eyes were the color of creek stones, gray-blue and steady, and the way he had handed her a packet of dried fruit on her last day, a small addition to her order that she had not requested and said only, "Travel safe." She had left the fort thinking she would never see him again, knowing that even if she did pass through next season, he would have forgotten her entirely. One orc drove her among hundreds of travelers. Why would he remember? But she had counted the days anyway, helpless against it, marking each sunset from the day she left until now. 367 days. She hated that she knew the number. The herd boss, a grizzled human named Samuel, rode up beside her as they approached the fort's outer stockade. "We will pen them in the usual field. Fort factors will come out tomorrow to do the count and inspection. You take the supply run, Hessa. You know the place." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and peeled away from the herd as the other drovers began the work of funneling 200 head of cattle into the sprawling pen system outside the fort's east wall. She rode through the open gates alone, dismounting in the dusty courtyard and tying her horse to the rail outside the supply house. The fort was busy in the late afternoon, soldiers and traders and teamsters moving between buildings, and she drew a few stares as she always did, but no open hostility. Fort Crossing was a practical place, more concerned with commerce than prejudice, and orcs with legitimate business were tolerated if not welcomed. The supply house was exactly as she remembered, a long, low building with a thatched roof and the quartermaster's window set into the front wall at chest height. There was no one in line. Hessa approached slowly, her heart beating too hard, and she stopped a pace back from the counter, trying to think of how to begin. "Hello, I am not sure if you remember me. It had been a year." He would have seen 1,000 faces since then. She should just ask for what she needed and not make it strange. She stepped up to the window and opened her mouth. "Hessa Druvar," the man behind the counter said. 367 days. Her breath stopped. Marcus Webb stood on the other side of the counter, his gray-blue eyes locked on hers, and his expression was as calm and unreadable as she remembered. He was exactly the same. The same short brown hair, the same solid build beneath a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The same steady hands resting on the wooden counter between them. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been expecting, not with surprise but with a quiet, bone-deep recognition. "You remember me," Hessa said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Yes," Marcus said. He said it the way he might confirm the sky was blue, a simple statement of fact. "You know how many days it has been?" "Yes." He reached beneath the counter and drew out a ledger, the fort's supply log, and he opened it to a page near the middle. The margins were filled with small, precise tally marks. Groups of 5 crossed through, marching down the edge of the paper in a long column. Hessa stared at them. Her throat felt tight. "You counted," she said. "I did." "Why?" Marcus closed the ledger and set it aside. He looked at her fully, meeting her eyes without hesitation, and for a long moment he did not answer. Then he said, "Because I wanted to know." It was not an explanation. It was barely even an answer. But the way he said it, with that steady certainty, made Hessa feel as though the ground had shifted under her feet. She had come here braced to be forgotten. She had armored herself against indifference, prepared for the small hurt of having to reintroduce herself, to watch his face for the flicker of confusion before he placed her. Instead, she stood here, staring at a year's worth of tally marks, and she did not know what to do with the enormousness of what they meant. "I need supplies," she said finally, because it was all she could think to say. "For the camp, grain and salt and coffee. How many in your crew?" 8 drovers. We will be here 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the inspection." Marcus nodded and turned away, moving through the dim interior of the supply house with the ease of long familiarity. Hessa watched him go, her mind still spinning. 367 days. He had counted every single one. He returned with sacks of grain and a wrapped parcel of salt pork and a tin of coffee beans, setting them on the counter one by one. His movements were efficient, economical, and he wrote the cost on a slip of paper in the same neat hand that had marked the ledger. Hessa paid without haggling, counting out the coins carefully, and when she reached for the supplies, Marcus said, "I will carry them to your horse." "You do not have to. I know." He came around through the side door of the supply house and gathered up the sacks, lifting them easily despite their weight, and Hessa followed him across the courtyard in a daze. He loaded the supplies onto her horse, securing them with quick, competent knots, and then he stepped back and looked at her again. "Will you be at the stock pens?" he asked. "Yes, East Field. I finish my shift at sundown. May I come find you?" Hessa's heart kicked against her ribs. "Yes," she said. Marcus nodded once, a small dip of his chin, and then he turned and walked back to the supply house without another word. Hessa stood in the courtyard for a long time after he disappeared inside, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had counted the days. He wanted to see her again. She had spent a year believing she was easy to forget, a passing face in a long stream of strangers, and the entire time he had been marking the margins of a ledger with her absence. She rode back to the stock pens in a fog, barely aware of the road. The other drovers had finished securing the herd and were setting up camp in the field adjacent to the pens, a well-worn patch of ground where drivers always stayed during fort inspections. There were bedrolls laid out, a fire being built, the evening routines that Hessa knew by heart. She dismounted and unloaded the supplies and answered Samuel's questions about costs, all on instinct, her mind still back in that courtyard. The sun sank lower. The sky turned gold and then amber and then deep violet, and Hessa found herself standing at the edge of camp, watching the fort gates. The other drovers were eating, passing around a pot of stew and a bottle of whiskey, and she should join them. She should eat. Instead, she stood and watched the road. Full dark had fallen by the time she saw him. Marcus walked out from the fort on foot, carrying a lantern that swung gently at his side. He moved without hurry, his stride steady and sure, and when he reached the camp he stopped a respectful distance away and called, "Hessa." She crossed to him immediately, aware of the eyes on her back, the other drovers watching with curiosity. "I am here," she said. "Walk with me." She nodded and followed him away from the firelight, out into the open field where the grass grew tall and the night was huge around them. They walked in silence for a time, the lantern casting a small circle of gold at their feet, and Hessa's pulse thrummed in her ears. "I did not think you would remember me," she said finally. The words came out in a rush, unable to be held back any longer. "I thought I was just another face, someone you saw once and never thought about again." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her. The lantern light caught the planes of his face, painting shadows under his cheekbones. "You were not," he said. "But why? We barely spoke. You did not know me." "I wanted to." He said it simply, as though it explained everything. "You came to the window every day for 2 weeks. You were polite. You did not treat me like a servant. You looked me in the eye when we spoke, and you smiled once when I told you the price of tobacco had gone up, like you thought it was funny instead of offensive. The last day, I gave you extra rations because I did not want you to leave." Hessa's throat closed. She remembered that, the dried fruit. She had thought it was charity, a small kindness offered to a traveler, and instead it had been something else entirely. "When you left, I started counting," Marcus continued. "I told myself it was foolish, that you would never come back, or that if you did, you would not remember me either. But I kept counting anyway. Every morning when I opened the ledger, I added another mark. It made the days feel less empty." "You were waiting for me," Hessa said. Her voice broke on the words. "Yes. I was waiting to see you too. I thought about you every day. I thought I was being ridiculous." Marcus smiled then, a small, rare expression that softened his whole face. "Not ridiculous," he said. "I am glad you thought about me." They stood there in the dark field, the lantern between them, and Hessa felt something enormous and fragile opening in her chest. She had spent a year believing herself forgettable, a creature too strange and too other to linger in anyone's mind, and here was a man who had counted every day of her absence like a benediction. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus's smile faded. The softness left his expression, replaced by something heavier. "That is what I needed to tell you," he said. "The fort is being decommissioned. The Crown is consolidating the border posts. Fort Crossing will be shut down in 6 days. All personnel are being reassigned." The world tilted. "Where are they sending you?" "East, to the capital garrison. I leave in a week." Hessa felt the words like a blow. A week. 6 days. She had spent a year waiting to see him again, and she would have less than a week before he disappeared forever, sent hundreds of miles away to a city she would never have reason to visit. It was cruel, the kind of timing that felt like a punishment for wanting something too much. 6 days, she repeated. "Yes, I am sorry. Do not apologize, it is not your fault." Hessa swallowed hard, trying to push down the surge of grief and anger. I am glad I got to see you again, even if it is only for a few days. Marcus set the lantern down in the grass between them. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not move, he took her hand in both of his. His palms were warm and rough with calluses, and he held her carefully like she was something precious. I do not want to go, he said. Then do not. It is not that simple. I am under contract. If I refuse the reassignment, I lose my pension and my discharge bonus, everything I have earned in 10 years of service. How much time do you have left on your contract? 2 months. Hessa's mind raced. 2 months. He could desert, but that would make him a fugitive. He could refuse the reassignment and forfeit everything. Or he could go east and disappear from her life as quickly as he had reappeared. What if you took your discharge now? She asked. Is that possible? Technically, yes. I could buy out the last 2 months. But it would take most of my savings. And then you would be free and almost broke. Marcus looked down at their joined hands. I have been saving to buy land, to build something. If I take the discharge now, I will have barely enough to file a homestead claim and nothing left to stock it. What kind of land? Good grazing land, open country, somewhere on the frontier away from the cities. He glanced up at her, and there was something raw in his eyes. Somewhere your cattle trail might pass through. Hessa's heart squeezed. He had been planning this, saving for it, counting the days until she returned and dreaming of a life where their paths might cross more than once a year. There is good land north of here, she said quietly. Along the trail we use. Open range, water rights, decent soil. The territorial office in Brantford was advertising claims last time I passed through. How far? 3 weeks' drive with the herd, less on horseback. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing slow circles over her knuckles. Then he said, If I take my discharge, I will have no income and almost no money. I would be asking you to wait while I built something out of nothing. It could take years before I had anything to offer. I do not need you to offer me anything. You should. You deserve someone who can provide, who has something established. Hessa pulled her hand free and stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they were nearly touching. She was almost exactly his height, her eyes level with his, and she looked at him hard. I have been on the trail since I was 16 years old, she said. I have driven cattle through floods and droughts and winter storms. I have slept on the ground more nights than I have slept in a bed. I do not need someone to provide for me. I need someone who remembers my name, someone who counts the days. If you want to build something, then build it, and I will come back every year to see what you have made. That is enough. Marcus stared at her. In the lantern light, his eyes looked almost silver. Every year, he said slowly. You would do that. I have a job, a route. I cannot stay in one place, but the herd comes north every spring and goes back south every fall. If you claimed land along the trail, I could stop. Every time. Twice a year. Yes. That is not enough. The word stung. Hessa pulled back, her chest tight, but before she could retreat fully, Marcus caught her wrist. That is not enough, he repeated, because I want more than that. I want you there when I build the house. I want you there for the planting and the harvest. I do not want to count the days anymore, Hessa. I want to stop counting because you are there. I cannot give up the trail, Hessa said. Her voice shook. It is all I know. It is my whole life. I am not asking you to give it up. I am saying I will come with you. She blinked. What? You need drovers, do you not? Hands to help move the cattle. Yes, but you are a quartermaster. You do not know cattle work. I can learn. I am strong, I follow orders, and I will work harder than anyone on your crew because I want to be near you. Marcus stepped closer, his hand still circling her wrist. Let me buy out my contract. Let me take the discharge. I will file a claim on land along your route, and I will spend the season driving cattle with you while I learn what I need to know. When we reach the northern end of the trail, I will stay behind and start building. You can finish the drive south and come back next spring. By then, I will have a cabin up. We can go slower. It was insane. It was impulsive and reckless and nothing like the careful, methodical man she thought he was. But his eyes were bright with it, alive in a way she had not seen before, and Hessa realized that he had been thinking about this for a year, that every tally mark in the ledger had been a day spent imagining how they could make this work. You would give up 10 years of service for this? She asked. I would give it up for you. You do not even know me. Then let me learn. Hessa felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry, but her voice came out hoarse. What if it does not work? What if you hate the trail or you realize I am not worth it? I have spent a year marking a ledger because I could not stop thinking about you. I think I know what you are worth to me. She kissed him. It was clumsy and sudden, her tusks bumping his chin, but he caught her face in his hands and kissed her back with a fierce, desperate intensity that made her dizzy. He tasted like coffee and dust, and his hands were gentle despite their strength, cradling her like she might break. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. I will talk to Samuel, Hessa said. We need another drover anyway. Thomas broke his arm last week and went home. If you can ride and follow instructions, he will take you on. I can ride. Then it is settled. Buy out your contract. Take your discharge. I will wait. Marcus kissed her again, softer this time, and then he picked up the lantern and walked her back to camp. The other drovers watched them approach with open curiosity, but no one said anything. Marcus stopped at the edge of the firelight and squeezed her hand once, brief and firm, and then he turned and walked back toward the fort. Hessa stood watching him go until he disappeared into the darkness, and then she sat down by the fire and accepted the bowl of stew Samuel handed her without tasting it. That the quartermaster? Samuel asked. Yes, he looking for work. Hessa glanced up, surprised. How did you know? Saw the way he looks at you. Man does not look at a woman like that unless he is planning to follow her into trouble. Samuel spat into the fire. Can he ride? He says he can. Good enough. Tell him to report here at dawn if he wants the job. We leave in 4 days, soon as the fort factors clear the herd. If he is not ready, we go without him. 4 days. Hessa's stomach dropped. I thought we had longer. Factors are fast-tracking inspections because of the decommission. They want everyone out before the fort closes. Samuel gave her a long look. Your man better move quick if he wants to come. Hessa nodded mutely. 4 days. Marcus had to buy out his contract, settle his affairs, and prepare to leave his entire life behind in 4 days. It was barely enough time. She barely slept that night. She lay on her bedroll staring up at the stars, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Marcus could change his mind. The army could refuse his discharge. He could show up at dawn and realize he had made a terrible mistake. The possibilities circled in her head like vultures. But when the sun rose and she walked out to the edge of camp, he was already there. He stood beside a sturdy bay horse, his few belongings packed into a pair of worn saddlebags, and he wore the plain clothes of a civilian. No uniform, no insignia. He looked lighter somehow, like he had set down a weight he had been carrying too long. You came, Hessa said. Marcus smiled. I counted 367 days. I am not going to miss the 368th. Hessa crossed the distance between them and took his face in her hands and kissed him in full view of the camp. Someone whistled. Someone else laughed. She did not care. When she pulled back, Marcus was grinning, a full, open expression that transformed his entire face. "Welcome to the crew," she said. The next 4 days were chaos. The fort factors came and went, inspecting the herd with brisk efficiency, and Marcus threw himself into the work of the camp with a determination that surprised everyone. He had not lied about being able to ride, but riding and droving were different skills, and he had to learn fast. Hessa taught him how to move with the herd, how to read the cattle's moods, how to turn a bolting steer without spooking the rest. He was not naturally gifted, but he was strong and stubborn, and he listened to every word she said. At night, they sat together by the fire, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they talked in low voices while the rest of the crew drank and played cards. Marcus told her about his 10 years in the quartermaster corps, the long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of chaos when supply lines broke or orders got lost. He told her about growing up in a small farming town, the youngest of 4 brothers, and how he had joined the army because it was the only way to see something beyond his father's wheat fields. Hessa told him about the trail, about the long, lonely stretches between towns, the way the landscape changed as you moved north, the secret places where the grass grew tall and sweet. She told him about her mother, who had died when Hessa was young, and her father, who had worked as a tanner until drink took him, too. She told him about the first time she hired on with a cattle crew, 16 years old and desperate for work, and how the trail boss had taken a chance on her because he needed hands and she was willing. "You ever wish you had done something else?" Marcus asked. "No," Hessa said immediately. "The trail is hard, but it is mine. I know who I am out here." "And who are you?" She thought about it. "Someone who does not quit, someone who can be relied on, someone who is good at what she does, even if what she does is not glamorous." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think that is who I am too." "Is that why you counted the days? Because you are someone who can be relied on." "I counted the days because I could not help it," Marcus said quietly. "Because I did not want to forget, because it made you feel less far away." Hessa leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that until the fire burned low. On the morning of the 5th day, they moved out. The herd was 200 strong, a churning mass of muscle and horn that kicked up dust and filled the air with the sound of lowing and the rhythmic thunder of hooves. Hessa rode point, guiding the lead animals north along the wide cattle trail that cut through the open grassland. Marcus rode sweep, the least desirable position, eating dust at the back of the herd and pushing stragglers to keep up. He did not complain once. The days blended together into a rhythm. Up before dawn, breaking camp, moving the herd north through the long morning. A brief stop at midday to let the cattle graze and drink. Then on again until the sun dipped low, and they found a place to bed down for the night. It was brutal work, physically exhausting, and Marcus ended each day covered in dust and sweat, and too tired to do more than eat and collapse into his bedroll. But he never faltered. He learned to anticipate the herd's movements, to spot trouble before it started, to work in tandem with the other drovers. He learned the songs they sang to keep the cattle calm, and he learned to sleep lightly so that if the herd stirred in the night he would wake. He learned that the trail was not romantic or adventurous, but simply hard, and he met that hardness with a steady determination that earned the respect of the crew. Hessa watched him change over the days. His hands grew more calloused. His shoulders grew broader from the constant work. He moved with more confidence in the saddle, and the quiet intensity he had always carried began to settle into something easier, more at peace. He was good at this, she realized. Not in the way she was good at it, with years of experience and instinct, but in the way of a man who had found work that mattered and was willing to give everything to it. They spoke less during the days, too busy with the demands of the drive, but at night they found each other. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply sat together, her hand in his, watching the stars wheel overhead. Once, during a night so clear the sky looked like liquid, Marcus told her about the land he wanted to claim. "There is a valley north of Brantford," he said. "I passed through it once, years ago, on a supply run. It had a creek running through it and good grass and a stand of cottonwood trees. I remember thinking it would be a good place to build." "How will you find it again?" Hessa asked. "I remember the way." "It is about 2 days' ride west of the trail, near the fork where the creek splits." "That is near the end of my northern route. I turned the herd around about a week past that point." Marcus glanced at her. "So when we reach that valley I will stay. You will go on without me." "Yes." The word sat heavy between them. Hessa had been trying not to think about it, the moment when the drive would take her north and Marcus would peel away west and they would separate after barely a month together. It felt cruel, unfair, but it was the plan they had made. "How long until you come back?" Marcus asked. 3 months, maybe 4. I have to drive the herd south and then pick up another for the spring drive. If everything goes smoothly, I will be back by late winter." "That is a long time, I know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will have the cabin framed by then, maybe even roofed if the weather holds. You will do it alone." "I will hire help in Brantford if I can. There are usually men looking for work." Hessa turned to look at him. In the firelight his face was shadowed, hard to read. "You are really going to do this?" she said. "Yes." "You are not afraid?" "I am terrified," Marcus admitted. "But I am more afraid of going east and spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had stayed." She kissed him then, leaning across the space between them, and he pulled her close. His hands were steady on her back, and she felt the solid warmth of him, the realness of him, and she let herself believe that this might actually work. The days passed. They crossed open prairie and forded shallow rivers and navigated rocky passes where the cattle had to be coaxed through one at a time. They lost a steer to a broken leg and another to a cougar, but the rest of the herd stayed healthy and strong. Marcus grew more capable with each passing day, and by the end of the second week, Samuel moved him up from sweep to flank, a small but significant promotion. "You are not completely useless," Samuel told him, which was high praise from the taciturn trail boss. Marcus grinned at Hessa when Samuel rode away. "I think he likes me." "He does not like anyone," Hessa said, "but he respects you. That is better." They reached Brantford 3 weeks into the drive, a small frontier town that existed primarily to serve the cattle trade. The crew resupplied and rested for 2 days, and Marcus rode to the territorial office to file his homestead claim. He returned with a map and a deed, both signed and sealed, and a look of quiet satisfaction. "It is official," he said. 160 acres in the valley I told you about. I pick up the final papers when I prove the claim. How long do you have? 5 years to build a dwelling and work the land. If I do that, the claim is mine permanently." Hessa studied the map, tracing the lines with her finger. The valley was marked in pencil, a small square along the creek. It looked impossibly far away and impossibly fragile, a dream sketched on paper. "This is real," she said. "Yes. You are really staying." Marcus took the map from her hands and set it aside. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and pressed his forehead to hers. "I am really staying," he said. "And you are really coming back." "I am." They left Brantford the next morning and pushed north into emptier country. The land here was wild and open, the grass tall and the horizon endless. They saw herds of antelope, and once a distant line of bison moving like a shadow across the plain. The nights grew colder as they climbed in elevation, and Hessa started sleeping pressed against Marcus for warmth, their bedrolls laid out side by side. One night, Wrapped in his arms beneath a sky so thick with stars it looked heavy, Marcus said, "I love you." Hessa's breath caught. She had been waiting for the words without realizing it, holding her own feelings tight against her chest, and now here they were, offered simply and without pretense. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since the day you gave me that dried fruit." Marcus laughed, a soft sound against her hair. "That was all it took. It was not the fruit. It was the thought behind it. You saw me. You wanted me to have something good. I've wanted to give you good things every day since. You have given me this," Hessa said, gesturing at the sky, the land, the impossible future stretching out before them. "You gave up everything you had to be here. I gave up a job I did not care about and a reassignment I did not want. What I got in return is everything." They made love that night, slow and careful, learning the shape and feel of each other beneath the blankets. It was awkward and tender and achingly real. And when it was over, they held each other in the dark and did not speak, because there were no words big enough for what they felt. The valley appeared on the horizon 2 days later. Hessa saw it first, a green crease in the land where the creek cut through, and she called Marcus up from his position on the flank. He rode beside her in silence, his eyes fixed on the approaching valley, and she saw his expression shift into something fierce and bright. "That is it," he said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." They reached the creek by mid-afternoon, and Samuel called a halt to let the cattle drink and rest. Marcus dismounted and walked along the water's edge, studying the land with the focused attention of a man seeing his future laid out before him. Hessa followed, her heart in her throat. The valley was beautiful. The creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and the grass grew thick on both banks. The cottonwood trees Marcus had remembered stood in a loose grove near the water, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. The land rose gently on either side, offering shelter from the wind, and the soil looked dark and rich. "This is it," Marcus said again. He turned to her, and his eyes were bright. "This is where I build." Hessa nodded, unable to speak. They spent the rest of the day in the valley. Marcus paced off the boundaries of his claim, marking the corners with stones, and he chose a site for the cabin near the creek where the ground was level and the trees would offer shade. He moved with a purposefulness Hessa had not seen before, every action deliberate, and she realized he had been imagining this moment for longer than she knew. That night, the crew camped in the valley, and Samuel announced they would rest an extra day to let the cattle graze on the good grass. It was a gift, Hessa knew, an unspoken acknowledgement of what was about to happen. Tomorrow Marcus would stay, and she would go. They sat by the creek together after the rest of the crew had gone to sleep, the firelight reflecting off the water. Marcus held her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her palm, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "I do not know how to say goodbye," Hessa finally admitted. "Then do not. Say you will see me soon." "I will see you soon." "How soon?" 3 months, maybe less if we make good time." Marcus pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I will have the cabin finished. I will have a bed built and a table and a door that closes. When you come back, you will have a place to stay that is not the ground. I do not mind the ground. I know. But I want to give you better." They sat together until the fire burned to embers, and then they went to their bedrolls and held each other through the night. Hessa did not sleep. She lay awake memorizing the feeling of him beside her, the sound of his breathing, the weight of his arm across her waist. She tried to imagine 3 months without this and could not. Morning came too soon. The crew broke camp with practiced efficiency, and the herd began to move north again, following the trail that led away from the valley. Marcus stayed behind. He stood beside his horse, his belongings unpacked and stacked near the chosen cabin site, and he watched the herd leave. Hessa rode back to him one last time. 3 months, she said. I will count the days, Marcus said. No, do not count anymore, just build. When I come back, I want to see what you have made. He reached up and pulled her down from the saddle, kissing her hard, and she tasted the salt of her own tears. When they pulled apart, he cupped her face in his hands. Come back to me, he said. I will, promise. I promise. She mounted her horse and rode after the herd without looking back, because if she looked back, she would not be able to leave. The cattle trail stretched north, and she followed it, the dust rising around her, the distance growing with every step. Behind her in the valley, Marcus stood watching until she disappeared from sight. The drive south was harder than any Hessa had ever done. Not because of the weather or the cattle or the terrain, but because every mile felt wrong. She was moving in the opposite direction from where she wanted to be, and the weight of it pressed on her chest like a stone. She did her work mechanically, guiding the herd through the familiar waypoints, and at night she lay awake counting the days until she could turn around. 84 days. That was how long it took to finish the southern drive, deliver the herd, collect her pay, and sign on with a new outfit heading north in the early spring. 84 days of waiting, of wondering if Marcus was still in the valley or if something had gone wrong. She had no way to contact him. No way to know if he was safe, if the cabin was progressing, if he had changed his mind. The new drive started in late winter, and Hessa pushed the crew hard, taking shorter rest days and longer hours in the saddle. The trail boss complained, but she had seniority and a reputation for getting herds through intact, so he let her set the pace. They made the trip north in record time, shaving a week off the usual schedule. When the valley came into view, Hessa's heart stopped. There was a cabin. It stood near the creek, right where Marcus had marked the site, a small sturdy structure with log walls and a steep pitched roof. Smoke rose from a chimney, thin and steady, and there was a corral built beside it with a single horse inside. Hessa did not ask permission. She simply spurred her horse forward, breaking away from the herd, and rode hard for the cabin. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and ran to the door. It opened before she reached it. Marcus stood in the doorway, and he looked leaner than she remembered, harder, his hands scarred from work and his face darkened by the sun. But his eyes were the same, gray-blue and steady, and when he saw her, his face split into a grin. 84 days, he said. You are early. Hessa crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and he lifted her off her feet, holding her tight. She buried her face in his shoulder and breathed him in, the smell of wood smoke and soap and the familiar scent that was just him. I missed you, she said. I missed you too. He set her down and pulled her inside, and Hessa looked around in wonder. The cabin was small but well made, with a stone fireplace at one end and a sleeping loft above. There was a table and 2 chairs, a set of shelves, and a bed frame built from smooth, sanded wood. The floor was packed earth, but it was clean and even, and the whole space felt warm and solid. You built this yourself? She asked. I had help from a few men in Brantford, but most of it, yes. Marcus moved to the fireplace and poured water from a kettle into 2 tin cups, handing her one. I told you I would have it finished. It is beautiful. It is home, or it will be if you stay. Hessa set down the cup. I have a contract, 2 more drives this season, but I will come back between each one. And after the season, I do not know, I have always done this work. I do not know how to do anything else. Marcus took her hands, holding them carefully. You do not have to give it up. I am not asking you to, but maybe over time you could take shorter routes, closer trips. Maybe eventually you could drive smaller herds locally instead of spending months on the trail. I do not need you to change everything at once. I just need you to come back. I will always come back, Hessa said fiercely. I promise you that." They spent the next 2 days together, and Marcus showed her everything he had built. The cabin, the corral, the small vegetable garden he had started behind the house. He had filed water rights on the creek and begun clearing land for planting. He talked about getting cattle of his own eventually and maybe some chickens, about building a barn and a proper smokehouse, about all the small, practical dreams that added up to a life. Hessa listened and contributed ideas, and she felt something settle inside her. This was real. They were building something together, even if she could only be here part of the time. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. When she left to rejoin the herd, Marcus walked her to the edge of the valley. "How long until you come back?" he asked. 2 months, maybe less. I will be here." They kissed goodbye, and this time Hessa did not cry. She rode back to the herd with her head high, already counting the days until she could return. The pattern repeated itself through the spring and summer. Hessa drove cattle north and south, and between each drive she came back to the valley. Each time Marcus had built something new: a chicken coop, a root cellar, a fence line. The homestead grew slowly, piece by piece, and Hessa found herself contributing more with each visit. She helped plant the garden, mend the roof, clear stones from the fields. The work was different from the trail, but it was satisfying in a way she had not expected. By the end of summer, she started turning down the longer contracts. She took local work instead, short drives that kept her closer to the valley, and she spent more time at the homestead than on the trail. It was a gradual shift, so gradual she barely noticed it happening, but one day she realized she had been at the cabin for 3 weeks and had no immediate plans to leave. "I think I am staying," she told Marcus one evening as they sat on the porch he had built, watching the sun set over the valley. Marcus looked at her, his expression carefully neutral. "For how long? I do not know. A while, maybe longer." "What about the trail?" "I will still take work when it comes, but I do not need to be gone all the time. I can base here and take shorter trips." She glanced at him. "If that is all right." Marcus took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "It is more than all right. It is everything I wanted." They were married in the fall, a simple ceremony in Brantford with Samuel and a few of the other drovers as witnesses. Hessa wore a dress she borrowed from the general store owner's wife, and Marcus wore his best shirt, and they spoke their vows in front of a traveling magistrate who did not blink twice at the sight of an orc bride. Afterward they rode back to the valley together, and Marcus carried her over the threshold of the cabin, and they spent their wedding night in the bed he had built, the firelight casting shadows on the walls. "I love you," Hessa said, curled against his chest. "I love you too," Marcus replied. "I have loved you since the day you walked up to my window and asked for salt pork. I thought I was easy to forget. You were impossible to forget. That is why I counted the days. You do not have to count any more." "I know," Marcus said, and he kissed the top of her head. "The counting is over. You are here. That is all that matters." They spent the winter in the valley, snowed in and content, and when spring came, Hessa took a contract to drive a small herd north to Brantford and back. It was an easy drive, only 2 weeks total, and when she returned, Marcus had started building an addition onto the cabin. "For children," he said, "if we are lucky enough to have them." They were lucky. Hessa gave birth to their first child, a daughter, in the middle of summer. She had her father's gray-blue eyes and her mother's green skin, and they named her Eliza. 2 years later came a son, Thomas, who had his mother's pointed ears and his father's steady temperament. The cabin grew with the family, adding rooms and comfort, and the homestead flourished. Hessa still took occasional work on the trail, but she never stayed gone long. The valley was home now, in a way nothing else had ever been. She taught her children to ride and to work with cattle, and she told them stories about the long drives she used to take, the open country and the endless sky. Marcus proved his claim after 5 years, and the land became officially theirs. He built a barn and a proper house, larger and sturdier than the original cabin, and they moved in with great ceremony. The old cabin became a storage shed, but Marcus refused to tear it down. "That is where we started," he told Hessa. "I want to remember." She understood. She still kept the dried fruit wrapper he had given her all those years ago, pressed flat in a book, a tangible reminder of the day everything began. They grew older together. Their children grew up, and the homestead became prosperous. Marcus raised cattle and Hessa took contracts as a trail consultant, advising new drovers on routes and management. They were known throughout the territory, the human man and the orc woman who had built something lasting in the wilderness, and their story became the kind of thing people told around campfires. But the best moments were still the quiet ones, the evenings on the porch watching the sun set, the mornings drinking coffee together before the work began, the small daily rhythms of a life shared. One evening, many years after they had married, Hessa asked Marcus if he ever regretted leaving the army. He looked at her, his hair gray now and his hands gnarled with age, and he smiled. "Not for a single day," he said. "I counted days once because I was waiting for my life to begin. I do not count any more because I am living it." Hessa took his hand, her own fingers just as worn, and they sat together as the stars came out overhead. The valley spread around them, green and alive, and the house stood solid behind them, filled with the sounds of their grandchildren playing inside. She thought about the girl she had been, certain she was easy to forget, and the man who had marked every day of her absence in the margins of a ledger. She thought about how wrong she had been and how grateful she was to have been wrong. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Marcus replied. Every single day. And that, Hessa thought, was the truest thing she had ever known.